Welcome everyone to the All In Together Aspen Ideas Women on the Ballot 2020 virtual town hall. We will be getting started in just a minute. Welcome everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome everyone to the All In Together Aspen Ideas Now virtual town hall, Women on the Ballot 2020. We are so happy that you are with us and very excited for this incredible partnership between All In Together and Aspen and the amazing speakers that are joining us today. I'm Lauren Leader. I'm the co-founder and CEO of All In Together. I'm happy to be your moderator today and also will be part of our first conversation with some of our amazing speakers. Just to tell you a little bit about our organizations before we get started. First of all, I hope you will follow all of us, follow both All In Together and Aspen Ideas on the various socials. We are a constructive and thought-provoking place on the interwebs, and I hope you will follow our content. I know that I follow Aspen religiously, and I hope you will also follow All In Together now as well following today's program. So just to tell you a little bit about us and why we're here together today, All In Together is a nonpartisan women's political leadership and education organization. We were founded in 2014 to bring civic education to a plurality, a diversity of women across the American political and civic landscape. We have partnered with the Aspen Ideas Festival because this year the festival had planned on highlighting women in the 2020 election as part of their programs in Aspen. Unfortunately, as with so many other amazing organizations and programs, they've had to cancel the Aspen Ideas Festival this year. So we decided to work together to bring a virtual Aspen Ideas Festival to the people today. And we're so glad that you're part of this. We hope this is the first of many wonderful collaborations between Aspen Ideas and All In Together. So thank you all for being here. And thank you so much to our partners at the Aspen Institute for making this possible. So for a little bit of background to this conversation, I want to spend a minute talking about why women are so critical to the election, but also really what is at stake in terms of gender equity writ large, the work that we do at All In Together and also the work that you're going to hear about from our other speakers today. You know, whenever you look at the measures of gender equity for any nation, you really have to look at three dimensions: the personal, the professional, and the political. In any society, for women to have full and equal representation, for there to be true gender parity, women have to have full personal freedoms, be able to live free from safety, be able to fulfill their full potential as humans. They also need to be able to make a living, to support their families, to have access to the jobs and career opportunities that they want and need. But the third piece, which is incredibly important, which we're going to be focused on today, is the political. And in the United States, in many ways, the political parity of women has lagged some of the other areas of American society where women have thrived. Notwithstanding the 2018 election, which was dubbed by so many as the year of the woman, the fact is that in the United States today, women are far from parity, really, given any measures that you might look at. The one area where women are, in fact, at or beyond parity is in voting. Women do disproportionately register to vote and outvote men. In fact, they've outvoted men in every election since 1980. You'd never know it from the public discourse, because the fact is that women's issues, women's participation in our political process, even just a focus on what matters to women, continues to be sidelined in almost every political process. It certainly continues to be sidelined in the media as they cover the 2020 election and indeed any election. But it's important to understand just how powerful women are. It's a very diverse coalition, obviously. They don't all agree. They don't all vote the same, but the numbers are powerful. Unfortunately, however, despite the fact that women are outvoting men, the reality is that the United States is far, far behind the rest of the world when it comes to the political participation and parity of women. Every time I show this chart from the World Economic Forum, even seasoned political operatives are shocked because the numbers are so astonishing. When we found it all in together in 2014, the United States was 54th in the world for the political parity of women. That was a number that we thought was shocking and appalling at the time. But look at where we are now. Even after the historic gains of the last Congress, we still are 86th in the world. It only takes a minute to start thinking through the list of all the 85 other countries around the world that are ahead of us. It's not just the Nordics and some of the European nations that you would think of. It's also places like Rwanda, South Africa, Tunisia. It's a shocking reality. And part of this is driven not just because we continue to have low numbers of representation of women in elected office, but also because in this current administration, we have the lowest number of women in the presidential cabinet that we've had in many, many years. So the fact is, across every measure, we have a long way to go in terms of women's political parity. And back to my point about the 2018 election, despite the amazing headlines and indeed the historic numbers of women, particularly Democratic women that were elected to this current Congress, we still haven't even hit 30%. Women remain overall less than 25% of Congress. That is a shocking reality. And I think one that seems to not line up for a lot of American women. Most of us actually don't know this number. And when we see it, it's shocking. What's more shocking, and I know my wonderful colleague, Aimee Allison, is going to talk about this, is that women of color make up only 10% of Congress, 10%. And the fact is that even across the states, women are vastly underrepresented in state legislatures. Only 2 United States or territories have reached 50% women. That's Nevada and Guam. So fantastic for Nevada. There's been a lot written. People are following very closely what's happening in Nevada because of these numbers. They're important, but still not enough. And then across the country, women of color are only 7% of state legislatures. This is true not just at the state level, but also at the city level, really at every level of government. And when you look at the issues that the nation's facing, particularly in the COVID crisis, which has a massive and disproportionate economic impact on women, especially given that the unemployment numbers are so heavily skewed towards women in the service industries, towards the service industries, hospitality, and other industries that are disproportionately women. You really see how critical it is that we fix these persistent problems in representation. So now to the election, before we start our panel with my wonderful colleagues. There's no question that the apathy and the frustration about the political divisions have worsened, and that Americans are very skeptical about the political process, which is obviously not helpful going into such an important election. The one bright spot is that women have certainly been saying that they are paying closer attention to the elections than they have in the past. But even despite that, they're not necessarily translating that interest into the kinds of activism and engagement that we at All In Together would like to see in order to really change the status quo. We need women to be volunteering for campaigns, to be making phone calls. Obviously, there's not going to be door knocking in this cycle because of the safety concerns, but we need people to engage, to be giving money to campaigns, to be participating more than just clicking on social media because of interest. And of course, for the backdrop to this conversation, the COVID crisis looms large against the context of the election. Very few states have set up structures in the past that would allow mail-in ballots. Only 5 states had all-mail elections before this cycle. Obviously, a number of states are looking at it, and there's an ongoing debate in Congress about funding for elections by mail. But what's really interesting is how much public opinion has shifted on this. 70% of Americans favor allowing voters to vote by mail without requiring an excuse. that number is a big tick up, obviously. And I think the impact of the illnesses that broke out in Wisconsin after to show up at the ballots in person was a real wake-up call for a lot of Americans. But at the end of the day, in order for women to continue to have the kind of influence and impact on our elections, we need them to turn out, and we need them to show up, and we need them to see their voices as critical and important. One way that we at All In Together try to facilitate the engagement and participation of women in our political process is through education and educational resources. The All In Together website, aitogether.org, has a handy dandy action center with state-by-state voter guides and details on what is happening in terms of the election in each state relative to COVID. I really encourage you to follow this. It's very difficult to keep on top of what's happening. Things have been changing so fast. I learned yesterday that in my own state of New York, where Governor Cuomo has in fact passed an executive order mandating that the allowance of vote by mail, you still have to, apparently, I learned yesterday, you will not just receive a ballot in the mail. Voters are going to need to still mail in a request for the ballot. So every single state is different. It's going to be critical for concerned citizens to be well informed and to be paying attention in order to participate in this next cycle. So with that, I would like to bring in my esteemed and fantastic colleagues for our first panel. And I do see that there are some folks that have started putting questions on the screen, which is great. You can type questions into the question box. They are going to be moderated by our staff, and they will be shared with our host moderators. Speaking of which, I would like to just take a second to welcome our dear friends and amazing co-collaborators. First and foremost, Margaret Hoover, journalist and host of PBS Firing Line, who we are thrilled to have hosting and moderating this conversation. Aimee Allison, who I think less and less needs an introduction. She is the founder of, I think, no less than 3 major organizations working on voter engagement and participation of voters of color, She the People, as well as Democracy in Color. Aimee has been an incredible voice, bringing attention to the importance of the votes and engagement of women of color in this and every election cycle. And our wonderful collaborator and friend, Celinda Lake, who also I think less and less needs an introduction, because Celinda Lake, any data that you have seen in the world, it seems, about women's political participation, Celinda Lake has had a hand in. She is also going to be working, she's working now with All In Together. We have new polls that will be coming out next week. We were hoping to have them today, but we will not. But next week we will have amazing polls thanks to our partnership with Celinda. But nobody knows the world of women's political engagement better than Celinda. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Margaret, to kick us off.
Lauren, thank you very much. And Aimee and Celinda, I'm really excited to be working with you and the Aspen Ideas Institute in order to have this conversation, because many people spoke about 2018 as being the year of the woman. As a Republican woman, Aimee, you can at least take some degree of solace that you have 3 times more women of color in the House of Representatives than Republicans do.
Low bar.
But the issues you outlined, Lauren, are incredibly potent. And I think, Celinda, I'd like to go to you with some, because I know you have some new polling data on this, but I'd just like to set the backdrop that today, the unemployment rate in this country, because of the COVID crisis, and I think this is the lens through which we have to talk about 2020 in a way that we just never anticipated. The unemployment rate is now 14.7% in this country. 20.5 million people have lost their jobs since the beginning of April. Okay, that put us at the highest unemployment level since the Great Depression. And the women's unemployment level is 3 percentage points higher than men. So I suspect that this will be a lens through which we see many of the topics that we talk about, and Celinda, the data that you're about to share with us. So I'll turn it over to you, Celinda.
Well, thank you so much. And it's great to be part of this effort. And what we're showing here is some data that shows you that the support for vote by mail has risen among all voters, except for Republican men, interestingly. But Republican women are very supportive of vote by mail. People want vote by mail as an option. But we're going to have a lot of challenges we have a number, first of all, we had a number of women missing from the electorate even before we faced the challenge of the 2020 COVID virus. And you can see here, 42 million women missing and not voting in 2016, including 5.7 million African-American women, 6.9 Latinas, 2.8 Asian American, 700,000 Native American, and a huge proportion of the millennial women and Gen Zers also not participating. Now we hit COVID virus, and we see women really overextended, not getting registered to vote, and a lot of challenges to participate even before we get to vote by mail. How women participate is going to really matter, because women and men are on two different planets. They really are on Venus and Mars in terms of how they perceive Donald Trump's presidency. There's a huge gender gap on steroids, and how they perceive his job performance during the COVID crisis. And you can see here, women almost 2-to-1 negative, men 5 points positive in terms of the job performance. So we've got challenges in terms of participation, and we have women really making a big difference. In terms of the economy, we see the same gender gap. Men think that Trump is doing a good job on the economy. Women think, no, who's this recovery really for? Who's being helped here? Not the vulnerable, not working families, but CEOs and big businesses. So two entirely different worldviews here.
Okay, great. And that, just to be clear, while that poll was taken within the last couple of weeks, how much, Celinda, do you believe that incorporates the current economic sort of crisis that is sort of slowly unfolding before our eyes?
Yeah. So what's really happening, it's a great question, Margaret. What's really happening is that men and women thought the economy was going to turn around pretty fast. Now there is real settling in of a sense that, boy, this could be a long way back. Women in particular feeling that. Women also saying it's jobs that count more than the stock market. It's small businesses, and 61% of women support small businesses, want to start a small business. It's small businesses that aren't getting help while big businesses are. So there's a very, very different view here. And I think these trends will accentuate, and we're seeing even more acute concern about the economy and what it means to be family economics, the 360-degree view of the economy.
All right, Aimee, I'm delighted to have you weigh in here. First, I mean, do you want to give your opening pitch about how you see 2020 and female candidates, particularly, I'm sorry, not candidates, female voters, and particularly women of color, matrixed against this current COVID crisis, and how that is going to impact, in your view, turnout and every element of voter participation in 2020?
Yeah, I mean, first I should say that the reason that disaggregating women by race is because race is a bigger driver into voting than gender is. The majority of white women in this country support Republicans and have for a long time. The majority of women of color support Democrats and have for a long time, since the Voting Rights Act secured women of color's access to the voting booth. So it really is, talk about when Celinda says two different worlds, for women of color, it is two different worlds. These are women who come from communities that have already been subject to two major forces that are at play in 2020. One is by both parties, a whole political system that has underengaged women of color and come to women of color for a vote or an election pitch very, very late in the cycle, and not recognize how powerful this really fastest growing group of voters is. And on the other, women of color are coming from communities that have been targeted for voter suppression. When you have exact match, purging from voter rolls and other kinds of techniques, women of color have been among the group that have suffered. So in 2020, when we look at the importance of making sure that every woman of color votes, we have to address those and the pandemic. Because the fact of the matter is, women of color are most likely to be characterized or categorized as an essential worker. And those folks are typically underpaid and underappreciated. They're out there putting their body lives on the line and are feeling the economic pain that is the whole country is starting to move into this sustained economic recession, some would say depression, with millions of people out of work. Women of color are in the epicenter of all of that. It's very important that we figure out some of the issues that were laid out by Lauren and Celinda. What does vote by mail look like in this environment, and how do we engage? When you started this segment, I thought it was really interesting. In 2018, women of color's turnout was 37% higher than in the previous midterm. And what that did was it was the fuel behind flipping a lot of seats, but also supporting women of color who became our outspoken, courageous, first of historic members of Congress. And I think looking at the power of women of color to be able to do that and the challenges of the pandemic, that's what we got to focus on right now.
So here's the question, and then I'll let both of you take it. How specifically is COVID going to impact voter participation and voter? Try to do participation first. Let's do engagement first. Voter engagement. How is this crisis going to impact the engagement and the mobilization of women? I'll go first, Celinda, since Aimee, you just finished. Celinda, can you try to tackle that?
Sure. And Aimee, I think I love your work, and I think you raise absolutely critically important and tremendously accurate points. So the short answer is, Margaret, we could make $1 billion for AIT if we knew the answer to this question. We don't know yet. It's a brand new world, but we do know some things. We know that women are really, really carrying a lot of responsibilities right now. We saw the very important poll that came out yesterday, and gotta love it. 50% of men said, I'm carrying half of the burden of the homeschooling. 3% of women said men are carrying half the burden of homeschooling. It's kind of like those old surveys about housework and how much each is doing in terms of housework. So women are carrying 3 and 4 jobs. They're worried about their whole community. They're worried about their whole family. Women have a lot on their minds. By the same token, if we think about new ways of organizing, we have a very receptive audience because we have people answering phones more than they've ever done, which makes polling easier. We have people online. We have people really valuing trusted sources. So the mom listservs, et cetera, really powerful here in terms of contacting women and engaging them. We have women as spokespeople. Voters are aware that women are more essential workers. They are incredibly grateful for teachers and nurses. My favorite meme of the whole COVID era was, I've homeschooled my child for an hour and a half, and I think teachers deserve to make $1 billion a year. And that was in the beginning. God knows what it's like now. So I think that we have a contradictory situation where we have new forms of organizing needed. We have very, very pressured and overburdened women, but we have women really engaged in what's going on and what the priorities are. And I don't know how all that sorts out, but it means we need new ways of organizing. And actually, I'll turn it to Aimee because she has done some of the most creative and powerful new organizing and highlighting of candidates that's out there.
Thank you, Celinda. And you're talking about the preoccupation that we have with food and shelter right now. We talk about women of color being essential workers. We should also talk about the health crisis in the Black and Brown communities. COVID's killing more people that are Black and Latino percentage-wise. It's been devastating. And the unemployment numbers are higher than that 14% among those communities. And so, when you have somebody who's trying to figure out how to put food on their table, where they're going to live, how they're going to, the rent. I have people who have small businesses. They haven't received any assistance from the government. A lot of small businesses, small businesses owned by, let's say, Black entrepreneurs, are not getting the share of the federal assistance and Small Business Administration assistance. So in that environment, Now you go to that person and say, we'd like you to register and we want you to think about an election. And the challenge is that that's a hard conversation to have right now. It feels like important, that it feels like it's important, but it needs to come on down the line. She the People's a network of networks. We work a lot with women in the South and Southwest. These are the traditional battleground states. This is what the conversations that I hear happen in a place like South part of Miami. How are you? Voter engagement says, how are you? How can I help you? You need $50 gift certificate for groceries. Let me help you in that way. And because voter engagement is starting with the basic needs, it feels like a heavy lift for us to get to the registration and turnout. The good news is women of color have these huge vote eligible populations, but among Black women, we have the highest vote turnout of any race and gender. So you saw the election you talked about in Milwaukee. They were Black and brown women who stood in line in the hail and for hours and hours to cast a vote. It's very strong in terms of the cultural importance. The challenge is when you're dealing with feeding your kids are at home, you got it, all of the issues that people are dealing with every day. How do you get people to turn out and vote? And for me, the key to this is in focusing on getting women of color through all of those steps. In Georgia, there's 5 in order to be eligible to vote by mail, and to spend a month from October to November giving people more opportunities to exercise their vote. But it's a new world, as Celinda said, and it is something that's going to require creativity and also doing things differently than we have in any other election cycle.
And with, by the way, not that much time, frankly, if we're really looking at the clock, not that much time.
80 days, right? It's only 180 days left.
So I want to get Lauren in here, and I'm so sorry, Lauren, I inadvertently skipped you on the first question, but I know that you have new research in your organization that deals with both engagement and mobilization politically. What do you look at right now in terms of the next 180 days for engaging women and how to do that?
It's very easy, obviously, against all of the reality that we've just talked about, to feel pretty despondent about the situation and conclude that it's going to be very low voter turnout, et cetera. I do think that there are some signs, however, that it might go a slightly different way. And I think Celinda's right. We're going to need to do a lot more polling, and we will be doing much more polling over the next few months to figure this out, because it is so unprecedented. But there are a few realities that did not exist in the 2016 election, which I think are going to come to bear in this particular environment. One is that since 2016, there has been an extraordinary proliferation of grassroots mobilization and organizing bodies, mostly obviously on the left, right? These are a lot of the groups that drove the blue wave, and Aimee's 100% right. The blue wave was a female wave. It was a blue and pink wave. It was a women's wave, as much as it was just a Democratic wave in the 18 midterms. But part of what made that possible are the huge number of groups who have been working on the ground to get people who've been on the margins of the political process more engaged, and did manage to register huge numbers of millennials, of women of color going into the midterm. So I think even though it's obviously an unprecedented set of challenges, I also think there are some signs to me that when you look at the way people were willing to turn out, especially in the primaries, the Democratic primaries, I think it does bode well for just a level of commitment. The issue is just we make it so difficult. We make it so difficult to vote in this country. Another group that we haven't touched on that I do need to just speak about, and then I'll turn it back to you, Margaret, is also the survivors of domestic violence, which cuts across every political party, cuts across the economic, social, and racial spectrum. The reality is that survivors, have been on the margins of the political process. That was 1 in 3 American women. And All In Together is focused a lot on registering those women to vote, getting them engaged in the political process. We've trained thousands of survivors over the last few years on political participation because they're so critical and we need their voices. Those numbers have grown to a truly alarming degree because of shelter in place. And we've done a previous session just about that. the point is that there are whole new groups of folks that are newly at the margins. And I think that's Aimee's point, folks that have gone from financial security to financial insecurity, folks who might have been more engaged in the political process were it not for this. So we're going to need every ounce of energy and organization and mobilization. And I say this from a completely nonpartisan perspective. We need women on, every end of the political spectrum to turn out. Obviously you and I have talked about, Margaret, the very low numbers of women on the Republican side. We'll talk about that on the next panel. But turnout needs to happen across the board for women, period. And I hope that all of the organizations, I think we're all going to be working overtime to make that happen.
It's interesting, Celinda, you said something at the top. Because people are home, you actually have a very high response rate in polling right now. Lorianne saying, maybe you're getting even more accurate polls, you're getting better data, perhaps. To what extent does, so maybe we'll have more information about what people think, but will that translate to how they vote? Because voting will be different, right? So there could be this real disparity, once again, perhaps even between the polling and the outcome of the elections, which really is about how do you get to voting, right? And how are we going to ensure that people have access to voting? Celinda, I'll let you take that, and then I'll go to you, Aimee, and then Lauren. About my understanding is in terms of vote by mail, and you showed the numbers, Celinda, in terms of women being more in favor of voting by mail than men. That about half the states have their act together and are ready to start mobilizing that direction. That about, shockingly, the swing states are among the states who don't have their act together, but it is states generally who are in charge of their own elections. We can say, the federal government needs to support this, there should be leadership from the top, and that's probably true. However, states need to be doing this. So who's doing it right, who's doing it wrong, and then how is this going to impact women?
Yeah, so there are a number of things. First of all, there's states doing it right and wrong, and there are states that are trying to limit participation, like North Carolina and Texas, adding rule after rule after rule to make that 5 steps that Lauren was talking about become 10 steps and really try to disqualify people. There's also in vote by mail a very interesting cultural difference along 2 lines. So first of all, there are states that are used to vote by mail, like Oregon and Washington, California, Montana, and Colorado. These states have quite high participation rates. Then there are states, we just did some work in Michigan, and people were saying to us, how do I get my ballot? It wasn't at all intuitive to them because it's been a very tough state to vote by mail. What do I do once I filled it out? Do I give it to the mail carrier? Do I put it in a mailbox? Do I put it in a separate box? Do I need to have it signed? Do I need to have it witnessed? Who can be the witness? So there are a lot of barriers here. And if you're in a state that hasn't had vote by mail, it's not at all intuitive to you how to do it. And then Aimee can speak to this more eloquently than I can. But there are cultural differences as well. Older African-American church-going women, they like to get dressed up and go to vote as a ritual, as a social activity. They like to go with their church members. Puerto Rican Americans very much like to go and vote as a family. And in Puerto Rico, it is a national holiday. Families go together. Obviously, in the continental United States, it is not. So there are cultural differences too in whether or not you want to vote by mail or vote in person. It's going to be very, very important for us to provide options and not just have all vote by mail, but provide options. And then it's going to be very important for us to really be committed to allowing people to vote and not putting false barriers in place. And there are all kinds of things that get in the way. One of the most famous cases that was most irritating to women voters when we were testing vote by mail was a woman judge in a small area, Republican woman actually, judge, who remarried, changed her last name, and they wouldn't let her vote because her old last name was on the ballot. This is a judge. Everybody in the community knew her. This is obviously someone holding up our democracy. So there are extra barriers for women that we don't have with men, and we've got to find ways to protect the vote, but also allow people to vote.
With that, Aimee, I want to come to you, but I want to buttress it with a question directed to you, which is from an audience viewer. Question for Aimee: what can women of color do right now to help outreach in our communities given the limitations of the COVID crisis? That's from Pam McDonald. Well,
thanks for the question, Pam. Here's the thing we have going on that's in a real strength for women of color. A recent report that came out at the end of last year by Groundswell and the Asian American Political Institute showed that women of color are most likely to get their friends and family to vote. Talk about cultural. I'm not the only, well, I'm not young anymore, but I'm not the only person who grew up, my dad taking me by the hand, going to the poll and saying, you will vote every time. Our people died for this right. We must trust this process, but we're doing it because we're doing it in person, because that's the way that we feel like it will be counted. We have to have, as you said, Celinda, we have to lean deeply as women of color on the fact that we are trusted sources for our friends and family to both become vote by mail or figure out how to safely vote. The women dressing up, those women are probably going on Sunday with their church. Those are early days they have in places like Ohio. We also have other ways of voting that I think are going to have to be possible and be part of that experience. But if we look at Asian American women, 76% of Asian American women in the 2018 election got their friends and family to vote. We have a real strength. So the concrete thing that we can do, and what She the People's doing, is we're identifying 1 million women of color, and we're saying we're going to educate people about how they can vote, plan A, B, and C. And we're going to get you involved in a process so that you can activate your friends and family. And honestly, in a time where there's so much fear, distrust, uncertainty, it is really the people in your inner your circle, your community, your family, who will be able to make sure that that we can actually do our duty as citizens. And I think that's the most concrete thing.
An audience member, how about, I'm curious about the number of women who aren't voting or engaging because they don't feel that either party adequately addresses their interests. Can you speak to that issue and how you address it? That's from Angela 7. Lauren, you haven't weighed in yet?
Yeah, and Celinda is really the expert, but look, what the recent polls are showing is that a lot of sort of undecided, non-committed women voters, particularly those who are registered independents or those who've been not committed in the past, have actually been swinging very strongly. You could look at it one of two ways, either away from the president or towards the Democratic vote. And I think not enough maybe has been made of that topic because they have the ability to be extraordinarily influential in this election cycle. In many of the swing states, it is the independent voters that were big factors in 16. I think they will be enormous factors again this time, and they're heavily female. Celinda, I don't know if you want to fill that in, but I think that is going to be, I think that is a concern for Republicans longer term, is that they are losing independent women, and they have been losing women who have, they lost women that have been have swung back and forth, sort of Romney women who have voted at various times, voted for Bush 43, then voted for Obama, and then, have been lost. So I think there's a lot of dynamics happening sort of in the middle, folks who are unaffiliated and unidentified, who seem to be swinging pretty consistently left. Celinda, anything, did I get that right, since you're the expert?
You're a good pollster, as well as a wonderful organizational leader. The other thing I would say is we need to watch millennial women, because millennial women are voting 2-to-1 actually Democratic right now. They're very, very Democratic, but they are some of the least enthusiastic. Part of it is they are swamped with young children and family responsibilities, caregiving responsibilities for parents as well as children. And they're trying to hold down jobs. They're trying to work full time, and then they've got 2 or 3 jobs on a good day. So I think the millennial women in particular, it's interesting because when we look at the data, millennial men who get discouraged head to the third party. Millennial women who get discouraged say they won't participate to vote. So they're a real target for us. And again, some of the relational techniques and online techniques that Aimee was talking about for women of color, and of course, millennial women are the most diverse cohort, would work for millennial women as well.
And I would just not only agree with that, but also add that it's about the appetite amongst the not just women of color, but the American voting population about how to meet this moment and what's going to be on people's minds as they think about voting. When we polled women of color in a very early primary state of Nevada, had never been done before, women of color likely caucus goers. And we use that as a way to say, well, how are you making your decisions? That was before the quarantine and the whole pandemic was full blown across the country. It was healthcare. Well, imagine right now with so many people losing their jobs and having no access to healthcare and really, really needing it. So healthcare as a major issue, dealing with the rise of white nationalism and racism, because that has been unleashed in this country, and really wanting to get behind both leaders and parties and institutions that can speak to both of those issues, I think are going to be big drivers for people. So I think it's not just the relational ways of organizing, it's how to talk about the issues almost like separate from candidates. Talk about your vote is going to matter for these issues, and it's going to affect your life in a really positive way. That's the way that we have to start investing. I think that, the Democratic Party, because most women of color are part of it, and all the institutions that support voter turnout need to deeply invest in conversations with women of color as a very important part of the electorate on the issues, and engage people in that way, because then we can have a longer lasting relationship with the experience of registering and actually voting. For us, it's not a swing voter situation. It's non-voter to voter. That's what we're trying to create, voters. And I think there's an opportunity here. It's a heavy lift, but there's an opportunity in 2020.
Well, thank you very much, Aimee and Celinda, for your time. Lauren, I know you have another panel that's coming up right on the heels of us. And so I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you, Lauren, very much for gathering us and convening us for an important conversation.
Thank you for a fabulous job.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Margaret and Aimee and Celinda. We have been wanting to have this conversation for a long time, so we are excited to have it, to have had it with you. And I want to, with that, we are going to transition to our second panel. And in fact, Aimee set us up perfectly, because of course, it is not just about voting, it is also about who and what is on the ballot. We're so thrilled to be welcoming three extraordinary women to talk to us about this. Really, none of whom need much of an introduction, but I'm going to do a little bit of it anyway. First of all, San Francisco Mayor London Breed, elected in July of 2018, first African-American woman mayor of the city of San Francisco. I think everyone has come to know the mayor because of the extraordinary response that her city has had to the COVID crisis, their quick response, which has enabled the city of San Francisco to flatten the curve in some ways faster than many other parts of the country. So I'm excited to hear from the mayor. She has a long history in politics at the local level before she became mayor. I'm also thrilled to welcome Parker Poling, who is the executive director of the National Republican Congressional Committee, excuse me. I wanted to hear from Parker because, as we mentioned before, unfortunately, Republican women have lost lost numbers in the House. There are now 13 women Republicans left in the House. They have gained at least one senator this year, a lot of competitive races, and Parker is really tasked with making sure for Republicans that they win across the board, and I know is very committed to seeing more Republican women win. At All In Together, we have done lots of work with groups on both sides of the aisle about women's engagement, and so we're thrilled to have Parker's perspective. And then, of course, Joy Reid, who needs really, truly no introduction. Joy, in respect to you, I am holding my MSNBC Decision 2020 mug, which I stole at 2:00 in the morning when I was coming off set on Super Tuesday. We are thrilled to have you. Joy is obviously, her reputation precedes her, incisive, thoughtful, probing, and incredibly important perspective on the news now and always. So with that, I'm going to let my moderators welcome Joy, Parker, and Mayor Reid.
All right. Well, thank you, Lauren. And I'll let you know, Lauren, that I am holding my Murphy Brown mug.
Oh!
Just because. Well, I want to thank all of y'all for having me here today. And this should be a fun conversation. So I guess let's just jump right into it. I think that now the introductions have been made, so I think we can just jump right in. And I want to ask both of you, and thank you both ladies for being here. Let's start by talking about just how obviously this COVID-19 crisis has changed everything about everything that all of us are doing. And London, I'll start with you. I mean, you yourself were one of the inspiring stories of 2018. You were elected. It was a year of the woman. You've obviously been a huge success before that and have been somebody that people have been paying attention to. Now you are trying to not just lead, but also what has been the reaction that you've had? Have you seen a lot of an increase or a decrease in the number of people who want to do what you do? Are more people talking to you about following your lead and running, or has the COVID-19 crisis kind of made people back off politics and focus on health?
Well, I don't know. I can't tell because I haven't been able to be around as many people. But I will say that after I was elected, my election to mayor has really inspired so many young girls who now have an interest in being involved in politics. The number of women interns that we have taken on in our office, and also the number of requests I get to talk to schools and kids who want to visit the mayor's office, and to hear the feedback from young people when I was first elected was amazing. And that is carried even up into this crisis. I remember one of my friends who said that her son said, Mommy, can boys be mayor too? Which I thought was, yes, I was excited about that. But it's during this crisis has been challenging because as a mayor, I'm used to being out in the community, meeting with people, talking to folks all the time. And now in the age of social distancing, it's been really tough. And the connections are really right now through the internet, through Zoom calls. And so it's hard to say, but I think that this crisis has really given a lot of women mayors in particular, and women elected officials in general, a lot of attention because people are noticing what an extraordinary job so many women leaders are doing in this country. So I think people are paying attention and also realizing during this pandemic how critical these roles are to saving lives and making hard decisions. So I think it will have an impact when the dust settles.
Yeah. And Parker, you might have one of the most difficult jobs in the political business right now. Obviously, 2018, 117 women were elected, but the Republican cohort in the United States House of Representatives down to 13. So it's tough. It's difficult to be a woman recruiting women to run for office right now. And then you have this other challenge of, the Republican governance is now on trial basically every single day. How has this crisis impacted your work in recruiting and trying to encourage more women to run as Republicans?
We've had tremendous success recruiting women actually this cycle. We have hit an all-time record. Our previous record was 133 women. We're at 223 this cycle. So we're really proud of that. That was something that from day one after the 2018 elections, that was a priority for the chairman, the leader, the House Republican leadership. So that's actually been tremendously successful. In terms of campaigning in the age of COVID-19, obviously that's been difficult. Most people, like the mayor said, you run for office because you want to connect with people. You want to be out there meeting people, hearing their stories, and that's much more difficult. So we're doing, Zoom events, Zoom meet and greets, online fundraisers. We're helping to connect candidates with incumbent members so that they can be a special guest for their events. And we're just encouraging our candidates to be leaders in their community, even when they have to do so virtually. So it's a challenge for sure, but I really think for the most part, our candidates are rising to the occasion and showing that they truly are leaders in their community, and that they are well qualified to represent the community after the election.
So, I mean, has there been a challenge, to stay with you just for a moment, has the president's approval rating, which is declining, and it's declining particularly among, as I think the previous panel said, most white women are Republicans, but he's starting to lose steam, particularly among college-educated women. Are you finding that he becomes a distraction and a challenge in terms of getting women to want to join that political team?
I really don't think so. Actually, in most of our polling, the president's numbers have been relatively static, really throughout the election cycle. There's some variation, but it's within a pretty narrow band at the end of the day. And I think the 2018 election was much more so a referendum. What we're looking at for 2020 is a choice election. Who do you choose to lead us out of, the crisis that's both economic and health crisis that's been created by this virus? And we feel that we're really well positioned in that choice between, the president, which is facing a lot of challenges, but showing, a variety of leadership, and then, former Vice President Biden. People are going to have to make a choice there and look at those two styles of leadership. And we think we're well positioned there.
Let's talk about the economic and the health crisis. It is a twin crisis, and Mayor Reid, you're dealing with it, firsthand. And so, women who even would think about running under normal circumstances have a harder time raising money, have a harder time being economically capable of running anyway, and women of color more so. And now you're facing a health crisis, and people are even more pinched for money. Can you talk a little bit about, when you were running, what were the complications of trying to prepare yourself to run and make it easy to run that you could see being harder for the next London Breed?
Well, I think definitely raising money was very challenging, and I was fortunate in that I had a lot of supporters and people who were out there, and I worry that what happens, especially because I'm the first African-American woman mayor elected in San Francisco. We have a less than 6% African-American population. Many people said I couldn't do it. And I do worry about an opportunity for someone else, but also I'm the second woman ever elected in the history of San Francisco as mayor. Dianne Feinstein was the first over 30 years ago. So what happens to the next generation of women who want to be mayor? And I hope that my leadership now serves as inspiration. And I want to make sure, and this is what I constantly do when I talk to kids. In fact, I was talking to a number of kids yesterday on a Zoom call, encouraging them to not give up on what they believe in and their dreams, because if I can do it coming out of the most challenging of circumstances and a lot of the doubt, they can do it. So believe in yourself. And in the face of this very challenging economic time, I think that my experience is, of course, an asset. Growing up in poverty, knowing what it feels like to struggle. And so this is why from day one in our Emergency Operations Center, which is the coordinated response for the city to deal with this health crisis, we embedded an equity team into all of the decisions that we make. So we are reaching out to the vulnerable populations. I set up a private fund, Give to SF, with the sole purpose of reaching those people who may not qualify for CalFresh and other benefits to help buy food and the things that they might need. And so we are reaching out to communities that are disconnected from government to make sure that they have resources and support, because a lot of these people are not working because they can't go to work because their businesses are shut. And what happens when you're living paycheck to paycheck? There's a strong need to help support your family, especially people who need food. And at the end of the day, I think that what people are seeing is, your experience in your environment can be an asset to helping you deal with the crisis in a way that I think makes a real difference. I find myself, my grandmother raised me, And now I feel like I'm my grandmother right now because I've had to get up on stage and lecture people about what not to do. And I'm like, if you guys don't stop this, I'm going to close the parks. If you don't do this, I'm going to do this. And I feel like, okay, all of that, I think, brings a huge benefit to managing something of this magnitude. And it brings a lot of humanity to the situation. So I want to really encourage young women in particular to not be discouraged under any circumstances.
Yeah, I had to get you behind in this house, Mom. So I know exactly who you're turning into. To stay with this, the economic challenge with you, Parker. We now have an unemployment rate of 14.7%, 20 million jobs lost in April. So we are now in a legit economic crisis. And that for, just the rudiments of politics presents this additional challenge. People don't have spare money, as I just said. People don't have extra money with which to run for office or to give. Have there been challenges that you guys are facing in terms of, it's not just recruiting, people also have to somehow be funded to run?
Yeah, I mean, fundraising, is always is tough in the best of circumstances. Anyone who's run for office can talk to you about the grind of just phone call after phone call after phone call. And obviously, it's tough when the business leaders in your community are having to, they're not getting paid or they're laying people off. And those are your traditional donors. So we've been encouraging people, just check in with your folks. You're not necessarily asking for money at this time. It's much more seeing how they're doing, how you can be helpful. I will say we have seen a really strong small dollar response. However, still our fundraising in the grassroots digital fundraising has actually been extremely strong despite the current circumstances. So I think that does demonstrate a level of enthusiasm for Republican candidates and a desire, even if it's $5 here or $5 there, to try and pitch in and help these candidates. So that's been encouraging.
And has there, I think one of the challenges, and I'll throw this both of you, but I'll start with you, Parker, is to get people to want to participate in politics. They have to fundamentally believe that the government can function, should function, and that it is capable of making change, right? That is a big messaging challenge, I think, because of what's coming out of Washington. It's probably easier in states because state governors have actually, for the most part, been doing a good job, and mayors, and the closer you get to the people, you're seeing more quality governance. But out of Washington, I think a lot of people are extremely frustrated with what's happening right now. And the idea that whether it's coming out of the administration or the slowness of those checks that are coming out, or you watch the debates between the House and Senate, that message cannot be easy to sell to people, to say, this is a gang you should join, this whole governance gang. What are the challenges for you, Parker, in trying to square that circle, especially given that in general, sort of the Republican message is not exactly rah-rah government?
Right. And we would all, tend to agree that necessarily the government that is closest to the people is the best. And your local leaders and state leaders are ones that should be making many of these decisions. I would point to the tremendous speed, though, with which the administration was able to put together this PPP loan program. And is it perfect? Of course not. But the amount of money that has been processed through these federal agencies, the speed with which it was set up, there was some foot dragging and some partisanship that delayed it. But overall, the amount of resources that have been able to flow to small business was really, really unprecedented. And I think, on that standpoint, I think a lot of people are pleased with that program.
And Mayor, are you seeing it that way? Because I'm hearing a very different thing coming out of, business owners and people who are at the receiving end. You are one of those governing officials that's closest to the people. Is that how you're seeing it? That people are feeling good about the way that things have gone, and that's something that would encourage people to get involved?
Well, I think that people feel, a lot of uncertainty and fear about what's going on because, again, there are many people, I would say, in our city, despite the wealth of our city, who still don't have access to resources to take care of their families. And even though we placed a rent moratorium on eviction. We placed a moratorium on commercial evictions as well as residential evictions. People still have to pay that rent eventually. And when we're talking about hair salons, where they're mostly independent contractors, barbershops, and other places like that, oftentimes these resources don't necessarily reach them. And even if they're able to get unemployment, they are paying their own personal rent or mortgage and cannot always necessarily afford their shops. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future. And we know that in the restaurant industry, in those industries that won't be able to open right away, and will not be able to hire everyone right away. Like, for example, in some cases, the stimulus money requires that you hire back your entire workforce. And there might be different requirements where less capacity is in the restaurant, so you won't need your entire workforce. And how is that going to be of service to you? So I think that there's a disconnect sometimes, or right now, I think, between what's happening in DC and some of the decisions that get made and what happens on the ground with people's lives. And that is definitely, unfortunately, creating a lot of uncertainty and fear for the future. And I think what I'm hopeful is that this second round of stimulus support might change that, in recognizing also the inequities that existed before this pandemic, are made worse, and especially in the African-American community and communities of color. And what we're finding even in San Francisco, disproportionately, you see more people who are infected. The numbers indicate that they are essential workers, and essential workers in the service arena, which are primarily people of color, and they are the ones being impacted most by this virus. And they also, in some cases, may not even want to get tested, because if they're not going to work, they're not able to generate any income. So I think that part of what we have to think about is not everyone has disposable income where they can just not work. Artists, musicians who rely on playing at events for their income. So I think part of it is we have to be more creative about getting resources in the hands of people and making it more flexible to support at least stabilizing our economy, because it's going to get worse. In California, over a $50 billion budget deficit. In San Francisco, $1.1 to $1.7 billion budget deficit. That means layoffs. That means cuts to education. That means so many things. So it is not, I don't see it that way.
Yeah. And if you think about it, in California has the economy of like the 7th largest country in the world if it was its own country. So that's scary to think about. There are now questions. I'm going to start to answer some of these questions from our great audience members. And I have an audience attendee that's got a question for you, Mayor Reid. And it says here, for women of color running for office, as it's harder to raise money, do you have to look to special interest funding that isn't always totally aligned with your values or communities? Should they have to look to special interest funding that isn't always totally in line with their values or communities in order to win?
I think that it's important not to accept money from someone or something that you physically, personally have a problem with. There's nothing wrong, with accepting contributions for people that you disagree with. But, because I've raised money, I get contributions from a lot of people and organizations that I've unfortunately had to vote against on policy decisions. You have to make sure that you stay true to your values. But sometimes there are circumstances with certain companies or people where I've returned checks because I had a real philosophical problem with their company and the way they did business. So I just say when dealing with fundraising, stay true to who you are and don't compromise your values for the money.
Okay, so the questions are coming in here. I have another question. This is also for you, Mayor Reid, and it's a long question, so I'm going to cut it down. They started out saying that some people may see you as a young person, which I'm going to just leave that right there because that Black don't crack, hallelujah. Let's just go on to the next part of the question. And they said basically they're saying that maybe people see you as too young, that they see you as young, and could that be a deficit for you? I don't know that that's necessarily a huge part of the question. But the second part of it is, what are you doing about closing the digital divide so that all San Franciscans can interact with their local government? Not everyone has an iPad, reads the Chronicle, or watches the news. And they say here, even AM Joy, the show requires a cable subscription. Thank you for knowing that. So what, given your unique background, would you suggest to other mayors for outreach to those communities about life-threatening issues? And then I'll also throw a question to Parker about the digital side.
Well, I'm so glad someone asked that question because, again, as someone, well, maybe I didn't say this, but I grew up in public housing. I lived in public housing for over 20 years of my life. And so before I was supervisor, I had worked on, as we rehabilitated our public housing units, which was my priority when I was on the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco. We rebuilt, but we also installed cables to provide free Wi-Fi to the residents there. And it's the thing that I'm most proud of, but also during this pandemic, we know that our kids who may not have access to not only high-speed internet for distance learning, but also computers. And so the work we did with the school district to add free high-speed internet to those areas where there are a lot of low-income students in our public school systems was absolutely incredible, along with laptops so that they can also participate in distance learning. I think we have to be very deliberate about not only making sure those resources are in these neighborhoods, but the money that I pay for my cable should somehow offset the expense of someone who can't necessarily afford to pay the regular expense, because they charge a lot of money for cable and internet, and you get the whole little package. And so there has to be, I think, a way in which, we're seeing it play itself out now in San Francisco, but I think we've been doing a really good job and have been a leader on access in many of our low-income communities, but we also have to make sure that we're holding the providers accountable to provide this resource, because they are making a lot of money from their customers who are paying regular rates. And so that should be offset. The cost and the expense of supporting other communities can be offset in that way.
Yeah, and I'll throw this version of this question to you as well, Parker, because obviously so much of what the traditional campaign, I remember working on a campaign, a lot of it is door to door, it's door knocking, it's very physical. There is phone, that's a huge part of campaigning, but now campaigns are really having to go, basically all digital. Can you just talk about what are some of the specific sort of digital changes that you're making and having to use? And then also, how do you deal with the fact that you've got a part of the community, including the majority community, that's very rural, that also might not have access to digital resources?
Yeah, expanding access to rural broadband has been a huge priority, for Republican members of Congress. I know John Katko from upstate New York has been a real leader on that. There's estimates of 35 to 40% of rural residents don't have access to high-speed broadband. So that is something that our members have really focused on. In terms of the digital campaigning, a lot of phone calls. The prior panel, we had Celinda Lake on, who was talking about how pollsters are actually not loving, I don't want to say pollsters are loving this stay in place order, but it has been really improved the rates of response on telephone calls. And, the Republican campaigns have access to, the RNC has built out a huge infrastructure of ability to call from home. And you can call right from your cell phone. You could be a campaign volunteer while sitting on your couch or at your kitchen table. And we've utilized that. We have 2 special elections actually coming up next Tuesday. And we've utilized that technology in allowing people from coast to coast to call into these districts and remind folks to vote on either one of the districts is entirely by mail, so make sure you mail in your ballot, or either mail in or turn out in person. So that's been a good infrastructure piece that we've had in place.
And Mayor Reid, to go back to you on this, to stay with digital just for a moment, we know that one of the dark sides of digital has been disinformation that has disproportionately been targeted at Black women, it turns out, in 2016, and still continues to be. This digital disenfranchisement is an issue. Are there things that you've been able to do as an elected official to try to counter that? And is there does your office have a digital information strategy?
So we have a Department of Technology with the city. And again, I want to go back to the equity team that we embedded in our Emergency Operations Center during the crisis. It's just an extension of the Human Rights Commission and the Office on Racial Equity. And so the goals of this office is to look at disparities and to make sure that the city is tackling these challenges, but also really a lot of the messaging around various communities is important, especially because as you said, oftentimes, and even I fall victim of this, the attacks and the racial kind of tension and things that are said about me as a Black woman mayor continues even, in this city, and having, this office that's really focused on messaging, outreach, support, resources, and empowerment is critical to supporting our African-American community in San Francisco, because what we see is the disparities. 37% of our homeless population African-American, 50% of those criminally involved African-American. We have less than 6% African-American population, but the victims of violent crimes and the statistics in our public education, a number of other things still persist, which is why there is a need on a local level, and also it should be on a national level, that we do things differently for a population that particularly is disproportionately in a negative way represented in so many categories. And this is why this Office of Racial Equity that we established, the goal is to focus on those disparities and to make meaningful change, and activation in this digital world is a critical part of that.
Yeah, and just to go back to the previous panel, there's a great conversation, and I think Celinda Lake brought up the fact that, traditionally among Black voters, voting, participation in politics has also been very in person. It's been very show up to vote, get dressed up and do it. A lot of our parents did that. Now that we're in this digital space, there is a big question of whether or not the vote and the vote can be moved. Yes, digital can be used for fundraising, digital can be used for events, digital can be used to encourage voting. But when the vote comes out, mail is probably going to be the thing that protects the most lives, particularly if we have a second wave of this COVID-19 outbreak in the fall. I'll start with you, Mayor, and then you, Parker. Talk to me a little bit about mail-in voting and how important that is, and how complicated it will be to move communities of color that are extremely in-person voting oriented, for you, Mayor Reid, to mail in. And if then we'll have Parker, I'll ask you a similar question.
Well, first of all, the good news is San Francisco is situated to address this probably better than most cities, because not only do we allow any voter in San Francisco to vote by mail, but we also pay for the postage, because we want to make it as easy as possible to get those ballots returned. So I think that a couple of months ago, when we knew we were going to be in this situation, we talked with the Department of Elections of doing a few things. Of course, getting everyone to mail, because there's going to be a possibility that people's garages and other places where we set up polling places, it won't be possible. But the outreach efforts are going to all have to be digital and phone call to get people to return their ballots. And there are a number of projects like APRI, A. Philip Randolph Institute. They target African-American voters, and they usually go door to door. They're already working on a system of outreach through the telephone to get people to vote by mail and to return their ballots. And so there's a strategy being worked out here because we think that polling places won't be as readily available, even though City Hall will probably continue to be a location, and we'll be able to do the distancing and set it up in a certain way. We may not be able to do it the same way in other neighborhoods. So we're exploring what the options are, the outreach strategies, and working with a number of community-based organizations on this issue.
Yeah, and the final question to you, because I have reached my time, I've gone a tiny bit over time. So Parker, this will be the final question to you. I know Republicans already vote more by mail than Democrats and independents do. So that's not something you have to encourage. But is there going to be sort of a broader move towards supporting massive vote by mail, everyone essentially being able to vote by mail? I know that there are no real primaries at the presidential level, but you do still have some primaries at the state level, et cetera. Is your organization pro everybody vote by mail?
Actually, Republicans have traditionally been primarily vote in person folks, and we've seen that across congressional elections throughout time. We actually just saw national data that 80% of Republicans prefer to vote in person. So our voters have a lot of concerns about ballot integrity and making sure that the person who has filled out and returned the ballot is registered to vote, is the person that they say they are. And so we're going to be keeping a very close eye on this, as of course we want everyone to be safe and be able to cast their ballot safely, but we want to make sure that we maintain the integrity of our elections, and that we continue to allow states to control their own elections processes and not be imposed a national mandate.
Well, the good news on that is that there is very little evidence that we've had that particular problem. We've had a lot of different problems in elections, but I appreciate both Parker and Mayor London Reid for being a part of this. I'm turning it back over to Lauren, clinking coffee cups with you here, my dear. Da, da, da.
Oh,
I think we both got good choices here, and I will turn it back over to you.
I want the Murphy Brown mug immediately. That's really good. Parker, Mayor Reid, thank you so much for being part of this. This was such an important conversation, and one that I know is not over. And just to like bring us full circle on our program today, I did want to just share a couple last thoughts about what folks can do to make a difference, to walk away from this conversation ready to make change in their communities. Except now I have the wrong slide, so you're going to all forgive me as we have a little technical challenge. Here we go, the last of our common points. So a couple things. First of all, it is more important than ever that women across this country step forward to become civic leaders in their community. It may not mean running for office for you. It may mean helping get folks registered, speaking up on issues that matter to you. Elected leaders need to hear from you on these issues. We would love for you to join the AIT Emerging Leaders Program, which is a free civic leadership training. It's all virtual, and you can go to the All In Together website to sign up to become an AIT Emerging Leader. We'd also love you to subscribe to Aspen Ideas Now, which is a rich resource of extraordinary thinkers and more great programs like what today's program has been on a wide array of critical topics in this important time. And then finally, we would love for you to join. All In Together is running with When We All Vote, virtual voting squads training. So the points that were made by everyone on this call about getting more folks registered, especially in this complex environment, has never mattered more. And on May 22nd, we will be running a free training on how to register folks to vote in this current environment. It is so important. We're going to try to get thousands of people to be committed to vote, registering thousands of others. And then finally, just a huge thanks to our friends and our partners at the Aspen Institute, to Trish and Kitty and everyone at the Aspen Ideas Festival who was willing to make this possible, their entire teams, to the team at All In Together, and to all of you for participating, and of course to our extraordinary speakers. We hope this is not the last, but the first of many important conversations about our democracy, about women's voices, about women's participation. And we thank you all so much for being with us. This will be rebroadcast on YouTube and through multiple channels. So we look forward to you sharing this with your friends and neighbors. And thank you all again so much. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe, stay healthy.